I remember the day it happened so clearly, like a snapshot frozen in my mind. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing seemed out of place. My daughter Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring in one of her favorite books. Her laughter filled the room as she chatted with her stepdad Mark about something silly, something that made her giggle uncontrollably. I was standing by the sink, washing dishes, a smile tugging at my lips as I listened to them. It wasn't uncommon for them to share moments like this. Mark had always been good with her, ever since we got married. I used to think of it as a blessing how easily they'd connected. But that day, something felt different. As I reached to turn off the faucet, I heard it, the word that stopped me in my tracks. Lily looked up at Mark with those wide, innocent eyes of hers and said, "Dad, can you help me with this?" I froze. The plate in my hand slipped back into the soapy water with a soft splash, but I barely noticed. My heart twisted in my chest, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Was it pride? Was it hurt? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that something about hearing her call him Dad felt like a quiet betrayal, even though I knew she didn't mean it that way. Mark didn't correct her. He just smiled, ruffled her hair, and leaned over to help her with whatever she needed. It was so casual, so natural, like it had always been that way. And maybe for her, it had. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a slip of the tongue. But the sting lingered, a subtle ache that wouldn't go away. It was as if, in that one word, I'd been pushed to the edges of my own family, watching from the sidelines as someone else stepped into the role I thought was mine. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, the tension in the air felt thicker than usual, at least for me. Mark and Lily were laughing, sharing stories about their day, but I couldn't seem to join in. Every time I tried to speak, the words felt heavy, stuck in my throat. I couldn't stop praying that moment in my head, couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice cutting through the haze of my thoughts. His question was casual, his tone light, but it felt like a spotlight had been turned on me. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, but I could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. Or maybe I just imagined it. Either way, the conversation moved on, and I went back to eating in silence, the ache in my chest growing heavier with each passing minute. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I was overreacting. Was I being selfish? Petty? Wasn't it a good thing that Lily and Mark were close? These were questions I didn't have answers to, and the more I thought about them, the more tangled my emotions became. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a word. It was about what that word represented, what it meant for my place in Lily's life. And as much as I tried to push the feelings aside, they refused to be ignored. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back to the way things were. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt quite right. I kept replaying that moment in the kitchen over and over again, like a song stuck on repeat. Lily calling Mark Dad. It echoed in my mind, refusing to fade, and with it came a quiet but persistent ache I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. After all, wasn't it a good thing that Lily and Mark had bonded so well? I had always wanted her to feel safe, to have someone she could rely on. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the feeling of being sidelined, of being less, lingered. And then I started to notice other things. Little things. Subtle shifts that, on their own, might not have meant much, but, together, painted a picture I didn't want to see. There was the way Lily would run to Mark with her problems before coming to me. She'd scrape her knee playing outside or spill juice on her favorite dress, and instead of calling out for me, she'd yell for him. "Dad, I need help," she'd shout, her voice filled with the same trust and affection she used to reserve for me. And then there were the conversations. They had their own inside jokes now, little moments of shared laughter that I wasn't part of. At dinner, I'd find myself sitting there quietly, watching as they bantered back and forth, feeling like an outsider at my own table. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Lily was curled up next to Mark on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. They were watching some animated movie, laughing at a scene I didn't find particularly funny. I was sitting on the other end of the couch, feeling the distance between us like a physical wall. At one point, Lily glanced over at me, her eyes lighting up. "Mom, isn't this hilarious?" she asked, gesturing to the screen. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's great," I replied, though my heart wasn't in it. She turned back to the movie without noticing my hesitation, but Mark caught it. He gave me a quick glance. His brow furrowed, but he didn't say anything. And that made it worse. It was like we were both silently acknowledging that something was off, but neither of us knew how to fix it. That night, as I got ready for bed, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for answers in my own tired eyes. When had things changed? Had I done something wrong? Was I losing my place in Lily's heart? Or was this just a phase, a natural part of blending a family? I turned off the light and climbed into bed, the weight of those questions pressing down on me. Mark was already lying there, scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil swirling in my mind. I hesitated for a moment before speaking, my voice quiet. "Mark, can I ask you something?" He looked over at me, setting his phone down. "Of course, what's on your mind?" I fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, trying to find the right words. Do you think Lily sees me differently now? Since we got married, I mean." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, sometimes it feels like she's closer to you than she is to me, like maybe she sees you as more of a parent than I am." Mark sat up slightly, his expression softening. "Hey, that's not true," he said, reaching out to place a hand on mine. "Lily loves you. You're her mom. Nothing will ever change that." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to take comfort in his words, let them ease the ache in my chest. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't fully understand. Or maybe he didn't want to. "Thanks," I said finally, forcing a small smile. "I guess I'm just overthinking things." He gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before lying back down, but I stayed awake long after he'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd ever stop feeling like a stranger in my own family. Because the truth was, it wasn't just about Lily calling him Dad. It was about what that word represented. The bond they shared, the connection that seemed to grow stronger every day. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt myself slipping away, like a thread unraveling from the fabric of my own life. The tension in the house didn't just linger, it grew. Each day felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying an invisible weight that only I could feel. Lily's bond with Mark was flourishing, and I found myself on the outside looking in. They had a rhythm now, an unspoken connection that seemed effortless. And no matter how much I tried to brush it off, it felt like I was slowly fading into the background. Then one evening, it happened. It was a Saturday night, and we were all sitting down to dinner. Lily was chattering away about her day, her words spilling out in a rapid stream of excitement as she recounted a story about her art class. Mark was hanging on to every word, laughing at all the right moments, asking her questions that made her eyes light up even more. I wanted to join in, to feel part of the moment, but every time I opened my mouth, the conversation seemed to flow around me, as if I weren't even there. And then she said it again. "Dad, can we go to the park tomorrow? You promised," Lily said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. Mark smiled, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "Of course, kiddo. We'll go right after breakfast." She beamed at him, her face glowing with pure joy, and my chest tightened. There it was. That word again. Dad. It echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. I tried to keep my composure, to swallow the knot forming in my throat, but it was too much. The laughter, the connection, the way they seemed to exist in a world of their own. It felt like a slap, a reminder of how far I'd drifted from the life I thought I knew. Without thinking, I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. Both Mark and Lily looked at me, startled. "I'm not feeling well," I said quickly, avoiding their eyes. "I think I'll head to bed early." "Mom, are you okay?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just tired." Mark started to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing through the quiet hallway as I made my way to the bedroom. Once I was inside, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my hands trembling. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the darkened living room, a suitcase open on the floor in front of me. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing with doubts and questions. Was this the right thing to do? Would Lily hate me for leaving? Would she even miss me? Eventually, I started packing. I kept it simple, a few clothes, some essentials. I didn't know where I was going or how long I'd be gone, but I knew I needed to go. For my own sanity, if nothing else. The next morning, I waited until Lily had gone to school and Mark had left for work. The house was eerily quiet as I stood in the doorway, my suitcase at my feet. I looked around, taking in the familiar sights. The family photos on the wall, the worn couch where we'd spent countless evenings together, the kitchen table where Lily used to sit and tell me about her day. A lump rose in my throat, and for a moment I almost changed my mind. But then I remembered the way I'd felt these past few weeks, like a stranger in my own home, like a ghost haunting a life that no longer felt like mine. And with that thought, I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door. The first night alone was harder than I'd expected. I found a small motel on the edge of town and checked in, the clerk barely glancing up as I handed over my credit card. The room was small and dimly lit, with a single bed and a chair in the corner. It felt cold, impersonal, nothing like home. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank TV screen, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I thought about Lily, about how she'd react when she realized I was gone. Would she cry? Would she even notice? The questions swirled in my mind, each one heavier than the last. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her laughter, felt the ache of her absence. But as painful as it was, there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Like I wasn't constantly fighting to hold on to something that was slipping away. The next morning, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Mark's name. I hesitated before answering, my hands trembling as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Where are you?" His voice was sharp, tinged with panic. "What's going on? Why did you leave?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I needed some time," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "I needed to figure things out." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone softening. "Lily's been asking for you all morning. She doesn't understand what's happening. I don't understand." I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it down. I didn't feel like I belonged anymore, I admitted. You and Lily have this connection, this bond, and I felt like I was in the way. "That's not true," he said quickly, but there was a hesitation in his voice that told me he wasn't entirely sure. "Mark," I said, cutting him off, "I'm not asking for you to understand. I needed space. Please, tell Lily I love her. I just need some time." He was quiet for a moment, and then he sighed. "Okay," he said finally. "But please, come back. We'll figure this out together." I ended the call, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to believe him, to believe that things could change. But for now, I needed to find myself again, to figure out who I was outside of being Lily's mom and Mark's wife. And so I stayed in that motel, alone with my thoughts, waiting for clarity that I wasn't sure would ever come. It didn't take long before the calls and messages started flooding in. At first it was just Mark, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one laced with frustration and confusion. "Sarah, please call me. We need to talk. This isn't the way to fix things." But it wasn't his voice that broke me, it was Lily's. Her small, trembling words, left in a voice note late at night, as if she'd snuck her phone under the covers to send it. "Mom, where are you? Are you mad at me? Please come home. I miss you." I listened to that message over and over again, clutching the phone to my chest as tears streamed down my face. My resolve was starting to crack, the guilt clawing at me like a relentless tide. But I reminded myself why I'd left, that I couldn't go back until I figured out how to heal this growing distance between us. Still, her voice haunted me, replaying in my mind every time I closed my eyes. A few days passed, and the tone of Mark's calls began to change. The frustration melted away, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. One evening, as I sat in the cramped motel room staring at the peeling wallpaper, my phone buzzed again. This time I picked up. "Sarah?" he said, relief flooding his voice. Thank God, I was starting to think you'd never answer. I didn't say anything at first, my throat tight with emotion. Finally I managed. What is it, Mark? He hesitated, and for a moment, all I could hear was his breath on the other end of the line. Lily's been asking for you non-stop, he said quietly. She's scared. She thinks you left because of her. My heart twisted at his words. That's not true, I whispered. I left because I felt like I didn't belong anymore, like I was being replaced. Sarah, you're her mom, Mark said, his voice firm but kind. You could never be replaced. Maybe I didn't see it before, but I see it now. She needs you. We both do. His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time, I heard the guilt in his voice, the acknowledgement of the role he'd played in making me feel invisible. But it wasn't enough to erase the hurt that had built up inside me. I don't know if I can come back yet, I said finally, my voice trembling. I'm not ready. Then take your time, he said softly. But just don't shut us out. Lily misses you. I miss you. The next morning, I woke up to another message, this time a video from Lily. She was sitting at the kitchen table, clutching one of her stuffed animals, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Mom, she said, her voice cracking, I'm sorry if I made you mad. I didn't mean to. Please come home. I love you. I felt like my heart was being ripped in two. The sight of her tears, the raw pain in her voice, it was too much to bear. I wanted to go to her, to wrap her in my arms and tell her everything would be okay. But a part of me held back, afraid that returning would only lead to more of the same. I needed to know that things would be different, that I wouldn't just fade back into the shadows. Later that day, Mark called again. This time, his voice was different, pleading, almost desperate. Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began. And I realize now that I've been so focused on building my relationship with Lily that I didn't see what it was doing to you. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't belong. I stayed silent, letting his words sink in. He continued, his voice cracking slightly. You're the one who's always been there for her. You're her mom. I was just filling a role. I never wanted to take your place. His words struck a chord deep within me. For so long I'd felt like I was losing Lily to him, like their bond was pushing me out. But hearing him acknowledge it, hearing him admit that he'd been blind to how it affected me, was the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in weeks. I need to think about it, I said quietly. I'm not ready to come back yet, but I'll think about it. Take all the time you need, he replied. Just know that we're here, waiting for you. That night, as I sat alone in the darkened motel room, I replayed his words in my mind. For the first time since I'd left, I felt a flicker of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But I wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. I needed more than words. I needed to see that the life I returned to would be one where I was seen, valued, and loved, not just as Lily's mom, but as myself. After days of restless nights and countless tears, I finally made a decision. It wasn't easy. I wrestled with my fears, my doubts, and the ache in my heart, but I knew I couldn't stay away forever. Lily needed me, and deep down, I knew I needed her too. So I packed my things and headed back home, uncertain about what I'd find but determined to face it head on. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. It felt both familiar and foreign, like stepping into a memory that didn't quite belong to me anymore. My suitcase thudded softly against the floor as I set it down, and the sound seemed to echo through the empty space. Lan? Lily's voice broke the silence, tentative and small. I turned to see her standing in the hallway, clutching her stuffed animal tightly against her chest. Her eyes were wide, her face pale with a mix of hope and fear. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then she ran to me, her arms wrapping around my waist as she'd buried her face in my stomach. I'm so sorry, Mom, she sobbed, her voice muffled against me. I thought you left because of me. My heart shattered at her words, and I dropped to my knees, pulling her into a tight embrace. No, baby, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. It was never because of you. I love you more than anything. I needed time to figure things out. She pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face looking up at me. Are you staying? She asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm staying, I said softly. We're going to work through this together. Okay? She nodded, wrapping her arms around me again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. A small but steady light piercing through the darkness. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Mark and I sat down at the kitchen table. The tension between us was palpable, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down like a heavy blanket. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Thank you for coming back," he said, his voice low. "I know it wasn't easy." I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I came back because of Lily," I said honestly. "But I need you to understand that things can't go back to the way they were. I won't let myself feel invisible in my own family anymore." He looked down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't see it before, but I do now. I made you feel like an outsider, and that's on me. I was so focused on being there for Lily that I didn't see how it was affecting you." His admission took me by surprise. For so long, I'd felt like I was screaming into the void, desperate for someone to notice my pain. Hearing him acknowledge it, hearing him take responsibility, felt like a small step toward healing. "I don't blame you for bonding with her," I said, my voice steady but firm. "But I need to feel like her mom again. Like I'm part of this family." Mark nodded, his gaze finally meeting mine. "You are her mom. You've always been her mom. I never wanted to take that away from you. I got caught up in trying to be what she needed, and I didn't realize I was pushing you aside in the process." The sincerity in his voice was clear, but so was the guilt. I could see it in his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped as he spoke. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. "So what now?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "How do we move forward from this?" Mark took a deep breath, his expression softening. "We take it one day at a time," he said. "But I promise you, Sarah, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. For you, for Lily, for all of us." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of cautious hope. Things weren't magically fixed, there was still so much to work through, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. Mark's words, Lily's embrace, the vulnerability they both showed, it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The next morning felt different. The house, which had once seemed so heavy with tension, now felt lighter. It wasn't perfect. There were still shadows of the past lingering in the corners, but there was a sense of possibility, of hope. I could see it in Lily's eyes, in the way she stayed close to me as we ate breakfast, as if afraid I might disappear again. Mark, too, seemed to be making an effort. He stayed quieter than usual, letting Lily and me take the lead in conversations, giving us the space we needed to reconnect. It was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. I appreciated it more than I could say. After breakfast, Lily tugged on my hand. "Mom, can we go to the park today?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. I hesitated for a moment, glancing at Mark. He gave me a small, encouraging nod, and I turned back to her with a smile. "Of course, sweetheart, let's go." The park was busy, filled with the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking. Lily ran ahead, her ponytail bouncing as she climbed onto the jungle gym. I watched her from a nearby bench, my heart swelling as I saw her smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like her mom again. Not just an observer, but an active part of her world. Mark sat down beside me, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment, we watched Lily in silence, the noise of the park filling the space between us. "She really missed you," Mark said finally, his voice quiet. "I missed her too," I replied, my gaze never leaving Lily. "More than anything." Mark shifted slightly, glancing at me. "And I missed you," he admitted. "I didn't realize how much until you were gone." His words caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. There was a sincerity in his expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. And for the first time, I felt like we were on the same team again. "I missed you too," I said softly. "But things have to be different now, Mark. I need to feel like I belong here, like I'm part of this family." "You do," he said firmly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you know that. I should have seen it sooner, Sarah. I should have been better." His words felt like a balm to an old wound, and though the pain hadn't fully disappeared, I could feel it beginning to heal. Her words caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "You didn't hurt me. I needed to find a way to feel close to you again, and I think we're getting there." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Are you happy now, Mom?" she asked. I paused, thinking about her question. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. "And having you in my life makes me the happiest of all." She smiled, her eyes fluttering closed, and I stayed by her side until her breathing evened out, the sound of her steady breaths filling the room with a comforting rhythm. As I stood in the doorway of her room watching her sleep, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Things weren't perfect, they might never be. But we were taking steps toward healing, toward rebuilding the family we'd almost lost. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. The following weeks were a mix of small steps and big realizations. Life didn't magically fall into place overnight, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were building something stronger, something real. Mark was true to his word. He made an effort to include me in every aspect of Lily's life, no longer taking over or unintentionally overshadowing me. If Lily came to him with a question or a story, he'd gently steer her back to me, making sure she saw me as the parent who was always there for her. Lily, too, seemed to sense the shift. She'd sit beside me on the couch during movie nights, rest her head on my shoulder, and look to me for reassurance in a way that felt natural again. We spent more time together, just the two of us, doing the things we used to love, like baking cookies or walking through the park. Each of these moments felt like a small but significant victory. One evening, as we all sat together for dinner, Lily suddenly spoke up. "Mom," she said, setting her fork down, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, my heart skipping a beat at the seriousness in her tone. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her wide eyes searching mine. "Like, do you feel like you're home again?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. But then I looked around the table, at Mark, who was watching me with quiet encouragement, and at Lily, who was waiting with genuine curiosity, and I felt a sense of clarity. "I do," I said finally, a smile spreading across my face. "Because home isn't just about where you live, it's about the people you share it with. And you and Mark? You're my home." Lily's face lit up, and she reached across the table to take my hand. "Good," she said simply, as if that was all she needed to hear. Later that night, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, Mark joined me. He handed me a mug of tea and settled into the chair across from me, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what happened. About how we got here." I looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I know I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I know I didn't see what you were feeling, and I hate that it took you leaving for me to wake up. But I want you to know, I'm not gonna let that happen again." His words were raw, honest, and they hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mark," I said quietly. "I needed to hear that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not just Lily's mom, Sarah. You're my partner. And I should have done a better job of showing you that. I will do better." For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed him. And that belief felt like the foundation of something new, something worth fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, our family dynamic continued to grow and evolve. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but we faced them together. Lily grew closer to both of us, and I no longer felt like I was competing for her love. Mark and I found ways to reconnect as partners, leaning on each other in ways we hadn't before. And through it all, I realized something important. I'd found my voice. I wasn't afraid to speak up anymore, to say what I needed or how I felt, and that made all the difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the living room, Lily curled up beside me on the couch. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, "I'm glad you came back." I smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Me too, sweetheart." Mark joined us a moment later, settling into his usual spot. He reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Life wasn't perfect, no life ever is, but it was ours. and that was more than enough. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that relationships aren't always easy. They require effort, honesty, and sometimes even starting over. But when you fight for what matters, when you refuse to give up on the people you love, you can find a way forward, even when it feels impossible. To anyone out there struggling with blended families, with feeling unseen, or with finding your place, you're not alone. Keep fighting for what matters, and don't forget to fight for yourself too.